So the rest of the time now, I'm planning to talk a bit about the book, obviously talk about the argument in it, and give you a flavour of that argument. And then we will have some time for questions and discussion. So I've scheduled it up until 9 o'clock, but obviously if you've had enough or feel you need to drop out before then I won't take offence. Just slip away if you need to. Okay, and so yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the overall kind of perspective of the book, which fits in really a lot with my other books. So we just had a request from Susan, which is a good one. If everyone could mute, that will help to prevent feedback noise, but obviously you can unmute when you need to. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about the general approach, particularly the approach to religion as a topic, and then I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the book and the main ideas in it. So, all my books are about the middle way in one sense or another. So the subtitle of this book, Buddhism and God, Seeking the Middle Way, is the subtitle in relation to this topic. So this is an application of the middle way, which is something I've explored in all my other books, and I've applied specifically to Buddhism and to Christianity in two other books. So the Buddha's middle way and the Christian middle way, respectively. But this is a much shorter, more focused argument about the relationship between them. So we've got two traditions here, two religious traditions, and the big problem really is that they're in conflict. So they're both, at least superficially, or at least as most people involved in them would say, they're dedicated to peace and love and compassion and possibly wisdom, things which should preclude conflict, but conflict nevertheless happens. So by conflict, I don't just mean holy war, because obviously there haven't been many holy wars anyway between Buddhists and Christians, but conflict produces division, social division. It also produces repression in individuals. So whenever there's, just think about the effects of trolling on social media or something like this, that if we get into conflict and disagreement with somebody, then this has an effect on us, and we take that conflict into ourselves in some way. And also when people take up rigid stances in opposition to each other, then this creates rigidity, which stops us adapting to new conditions. So because both Buddhism and the theistic religions have become rigid in specific ways, they've not adapted in other ways because of it. So applying the middle way to Buddhism and God is a test case of applying the middle way generally. So you can apply it to all sorts of things, but it's particularly concerned with the conflicts and differences between Buddhism and Christianity and how we can resolve them, or how they could be resolved. And the basic sort of analysis, I guess, of conflict in the way I write about it is that it's created by incompatible absolute assumptions. So an absolute assumption is where you've got any set of beliefs and you think you've got the whole story. So this is the true set of beliefs. They may be positive, they may be negative, so they may be beliefs about what is not true or what is false. And similarly, if you think you've got the whole story, then that's absolute. So if you think you've got the whole story, then you're going to tend to get into conflict with other people who think they've also got the whole story and it's different from your story. So then, of course, you get into, what I'm sure will be familiar experiences too, of conflict. So people block each other, they misunderstand each other, they may even find each other's positions meaningless. They don't really understand what other people are saying, and they're not in a position to learn from others. So this is especially ironic between people who are apparently pledged to heal those divisions by their whole attitudes and way of life. So those assumptions, those absolute assumptions, are not inevitable. I guess that's one of my key arguments in the whole of my work. You know, that we are not. It's not determined. It's not inevitable that we will always make absolute assumptions. Although, of course, we may not be able to completely remove them from our experience, but we can work so as to reduce them. We can reduce absolute assumptions by reframing. So reframing means looking at our experiences, looking at our beliefs and trying to put them in a different frame. And to do that, I think we need to go back to our experiences. So what is it that we as humans experience that might lead us into Buddhism or into theistic religions like Christianity or Islam, for example? There's a whole set of experiences that lead people into religious positions, which are very broadly called religious experiences. And I think we should, there are all kinds of ideas people have about religious experience and definitions of it. I think we should understand that term quite broadly. But basically they're human experiences. Perhaps the Buddhist tradition has some of the most accessible ways of talking about them. So talking about the jhanas, for example. So the jhanas are absorbed states of intense mindfulness, awareness, concentration, positive emotion that you can reach through meditative practice, or you may encounter spontaneously in other circumstances as well. So I don't think there are many Buddhists who would say it's only Buddhists who get into jhana. Yeah, so that's a universal, it's a human experience to be able to access these more inspired states, these more open states. So it would be pretty weird if it was only Buddhists and not Christians, for example, that got into jhana. And then there's the states described by Christian mystics, often in terms of being part of being unified with God would be the way that they talk about it. But being unified in the experience of love, for example, particularly experience of openness and insight from somewhere they weren't expecting, from somewhere else. So we've got these we've got lots of different kinds of accounts of religious experience. I won't try and go through all the different types there might be. I just want to make the point that they could be very ordinary. So I think the kinds of experiences that sometimes sustain people in their faith, as they would see it, might just be little experiences of openness or of some new insight or new, perhaps a new emotional openness. Let me give you an example from my own experience of just such a little thing. So at one time I used to cycle to work in a college from about 3 miles along a main road. And most of that route was hemmed in by shops and houses and so on, and flats. But then there was just one point I used to look forward to, where I'd come out of the shops and flats and so on. And on one side, there was an enormous open field. So I'd certainly get a sense of space as I cycled into that area. And I could also look over the field and see the sea, because it was near the sea. So I would get an experience every morning, pretty much, of openness. Yeah, there's something more. It's not just this being hemmed in, and this always thinking, oh, that's all there is. And obviously that's just aesthetic. It's not a big deal, but it's a little opening that maybe changed my mental state a little bit each morning. So I would suggest a religious experience might be as trivial as that. You know, it's just something that reminds us that we could learn something from somewhere else, and we haven't just got the whole story all the time. So those sorts of experiences, those human experiences, if we go back to those sorts of experiences, we'll probably find that people everywhere have fairly similar ones, because the whole way we operate, our human needs, the structure of our brains and bodies help to create these sorts of experiences. So when people have those experiences, they then associate them with symbols, whether those are words or pictures, or whatever they are. So you might feel you've had an experience of God. You might feel you've had an experience of enlightenment, or jhana, or whatever label you apply to it. So that then becomes the meaning of the experience, if you like, yeah. And so when you come across that symbol again, that has associations with that experience of being somewhat more open, finding something that you might grow into. So that's, I think, at the root of what I would call archetypal symbols. And my forthcoming book, which is called Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, goes into this in a lot more detail. Basically, this idea of this understanding of archetypes, not as depending on obscure theories about the collective unconscious or any of this, but simply as focusing on what they do, yeah, as functions in our lives, as inspiring reminders of how we can develop, of how we can open up in some way. So archetypal symbols can help us to recall our inspiration. Now that seems so far so good, yeah. That's what I call maybe an optimistic account of experiences people have behind religion. But then they also, those experiences and those symbols become associated with absolute beliefs. I'm not going to go into sort of historical speculations about exactly when this happened or anything like that. Just that seems to be the fact. And you only have to, to ascertain that, just talk to most religious followers who will immediately say, I'm a Christian believer or whatever. Yeah, they will associate these experiences with absolute beliefs, which are the whole story about something. So why do people make that association? My suggestion is that it's a very useful shortcut for people, or for societies. So you can very quickly get a group identification by sharing an absolute belief. So instead of having a sort of big sort of group discussion about what your religious experiences are, which might take hours, you can just say, Jesus saves us, yeah, and everybody believes that, and everybody immediately switches in from that absolute statement about a belief. They're quickly bound together by that shortcut. So you can see how useful it is, particularly if you're in a position of authority in a group and you want a quick way of binding together that group. So these shortcuts, these absolute beliefs, can be easily recalled, easily shared, because they're quick. They don't require you to go through an energy draining process, recalling a complex experience and trying to share it with other people. That takes much longer. So when people get into the habit of using those shortcuts, then they tend to get ideologically entrenched. The shortcuts get associated with each other. They form big networks of theological belief. They become associated with social structures. So God put the rich in their towers and the poor in their hovels, and that's all part of his will, or it's the caste system in India and so on. So all of these kinds of social structures can be justified by appeals to absolute belief. And people also get into psychological habits, which they form around these beliefs. And of course, when people do that, as I mentioned earlier, then they start forming the conditions for conflict. So maybe that absolute belief works in a restricted space, specific context for those people, but put them into contact with new people who think something different, and you've got a recipe for conflict. Or if the conditions change a lot, maybe those beliefs just don't work very well, they're maladapted. But it's quite difficult to change them once you've got into them, and they're passed down by inflexible elements of tradition. And the various defense mechanisms which religions use to maintain absolute beliefs, or perhaps you could say religious beliefs, or religious interests, or absolute interests used to maintain themselves. And one of those is essentialism. So essentialism is where you believe strongly that the meaning of the symbols we use and the words we use, particularly, is fixed, and necessary. So God means, for example, a supernatural being, with everything that goes with being supernatural. So being perfect and infinite and omniscient and all that. So that becomes fixed and necessary. That becomes what God means, and it becomes what you will find if you look it up in a dictionary, or let alone in a theological treatise about it. And you'll get similar things in Buddhism. So the belief that Buddhism is necessarily a belief that the Buddha was enlightened, for example. So these essentializations become associated with a complex tradition and take them over. And I think the other interesting thing is that obviously in recent times we've had a lot of reaction to religion and a lot of critical responses to religion. But very often the critics of religion are polarized against it, and they buy the essentializations. So the Richard Dawkins style argument against God, for example, takes the essentialism for granted. So that's what theistic religion is. It's belief in God. God is a supernatural being. You shouldn't believe in supernatural beings, goes on Dawkins, for the X, Y, Z reasons. So rather than going back to the experience and asking people, why do these people believe in God? Where did it come from? He says, this is a set of beliefs. I don't believe in that. And so then you get another kind of polarized conflict. So my argument is, in order to diffuse these conflicts, we've got to go further than just questioning them in the way Dawkins does to set up a polarized opposite. We have to question the essentialization. So we have to ask, what do we mean by Buddhism? What do we mean by God? Because what we mean by religion, if we look at it more closely, has to be something much more complex than just belief in whatever it is. So Ninian Smart, for example, was a great scholar of religious studies from the 60s and 70s. And he analysed lots of different religions, so-called, and identified 7 different dimensions of those religions. So that all religions, he thought, have a mythic element, so they tell stories, they have rituals, they have a moral element, they have a social element, so there's social groupings, they have a doctrinal element, they have an experiential element, and they have a material element. So material element is the things in religion, like churches or altars or whatever. So now only one of those is doctrines, only one of those is beliefs. All the others are other aspects of religion, which people might find very helpful to continue to inspire them in their development and indeed in their relationship with others in all sorts of ways. So I don't think it helps us to simply define religion as belief. We have to accept that it's more complex than that. But obviously, to try and deal with the essentializations, then we need to ask more closely, well, what do these religions mean? And what do people think they mean? And how do we resolve the conflicts between what they think they mean? So that's basically what Buddhism and God is about, to come more to the point. So perhaps at this point I can show you a PowerPoint. This is just a summary of the 6 chapters of the book, briefly. Yes. Okay, so the 6 chapters of the book are structured around firstly theism and Buddhism, and thirdly universalism. So 3 standpoints, 3 views about what Buddhism and God respectively mean, applied to Buddhism and God. So starting with the theists, the people who believe in God, what God means to theists, then what Buddhism means to theists, what God means to Buddhists, what Buddhism means to Buddhists, and then universalists, so people who believe it's all one, are another set of people we need to take into account here, because that is quite an established position in some ways. So what God means for universalists and what Buddhism means for universalists. So just to take those one at a time, to just give you a rough idea of the argument in those 6 chapters. So what God means to theists, first of all. So that's an absolute or a supernatural object of belief. But of course, as I've already argued, that's not the only possible way of looking at it. And the key thing there is that it's there's a very heavily built up, a very entrenched tradition of assuming that that's what God means, and that what people's experiences of God means. So their experiences and their symbols of God, it's claimed, must mean this supernatural being, this absolute being. But there's no necessary link at all once you start looking at it. It's just a story, as far as I can see. And I've found, and I've argued with quite a few people about this, and I just find, they just can't, quite often they can't adapt to any other story. They're just so used to that story that God must be absolute, and that's it. But I haven't come across any real argument that shows that it's necessary to see God in that way. Obviously, other than there's a practical argument in certain extreme situations. Maybe if you have to mobilize people in a quick way, from the point of view of social expediency, to all believe the same thing and all behave in a similar way, then that's an efficient way to do it. But we're not in that world. We haven't been for some time, I don't think. And I hope we're not about to go back to it, but we'll have to see, obviously, with the effects of climate change on our civilization. So a set of absolute beliefs that might have been necessary in some ancient situations, we're still carrying that baggage, it seems, in the assumptions we make about God. Then, secondly, what Buddhism means for theists. Now, what Buddhism means for theists is not a true religion, generally speaking, or as the Catholic Church has put it, a human religion, which is kind of second class, as it were, rather than a religion of belief in the true God as they see it. But there's a very interesting book which I've consulted for this chapter, which is called Unexpected Way, written by a Buddhist scholar, a scholar of Mahayana Buddhism, called Paul Williams from Bristol University, who used to be a Buddhist and converted to Catholicism. And Unexpected Way is an account of his conversion and why he converted. So I got a lot from that as to well, what kind of perspective lies behind that when theists react to Buddhism. And what it seems to come down to is the idea that, well, he was looking for a kind of certainty which he couldn't find in Buddhism. So he found emptiness, and he was obviously particularly familiar with that kind of interpretation of Buddhism because he was a Mahayana scholar. So he found lots of grounds for doubt and paradox and so on, but he didn't find anything which could replace the certainty he was looking for. And there's an assumption there, obviously, that religion has to have that certainty in it. Now, some Buddhists, I think, do try and import that certainty into Buddhism, but perhaps not so much in the West, and perhaps in more subtle ways. Going on to the third chapter. So what God means to Buddhists. So the classic Buddhist analysis is that belief in God is eternalist. So eternalism is a set of beliefs which are associated with belief in the eternal soul or self, which allows you your deeds to be punished in the future, even in future lives. So there's a particular context to the idea of eternalism and its opposite, nihilism, which comes from the time of the Buddha. But I think, well, those categorizations of absolute belief worked in their time. And myself, I went through a long process doing my PhD thesis, trying to make them work in our time, trying to categorize Western philosophies in terms of eternalism and nihilism, and it just didn't work. So without taking you through that whole process, my conclusion was that we're much better just thinking in terms of the middle way as something that avoids absolute belief, not in those specific terms, even if those terms work for the Buddha. So for traditional Buddhists, God is wrong because it's eternalist, but I think it would be much more apt to say that the issue is absolute belief in God rather than necessarily just eternalism. In the process of taking that view of God, I find that Buddhists often downplay the similarities in experience. So they might argue that enlightenment is a different kind of experience to the ones that Christians have, and different kinds of approaches to meaning. So again, that the Buddha means something very different from God, and again, question that because that meaning depends on associations with experience. So that's what leads, I think, also to the arguments about, is Buddhism atheistic or agnostic? And you get different views on that. But quite often the atheist interpretation seems to me to be based on a reaction against theistic religion, which depends again on this idea that it's wrong because it's eternalist. So fourthly, what Buddhism means to Buddhists. So there you get the claim that Buddhism is the pursuit of enlightenment, and that it's in some way more accessible or non-metaphysical in a way that God isn't. On the grounds that you can get there. So if you keep working at it, if you keep practicing, then you'll eventually reach enlightenment. So then you can see for yourself whether it's correct or not, whether what's been said about it is right. I don't buy that, because I think the enlightenment experience is in practice just as remote from people as God. I don't know anyone who's enlightened, and I don't know anyone who can really identify who's enlightened either. So I think enlightenment is largely just an abstract idea. Obviously, some people have used it in ways that are more immediate, like Stephen Batchelor, for example, has used it more to talk about non-reactivity, really. So he's used it in a different sense. But if you're seeing it as the goal of the Buddhist path, then it rapidly turns into something that functions rather like God does. It's a justification for an absolute view. You can then say, well, the Buddha reached that, so he's got an absolutely true view, which he can tell you about, he can reveal to you. Then the next chapter is about God for universalists. So universalists have a slightly different view. So they would stress the similarities between God and Buddhism, and they would say those similarities are due to something they call ultimate reality. So I would agree with them that the experiences and the symbols do have something similar behind them. They're all human. But you could say the essentialist defense is still operating here, because they insist on understanding that similarity between the religions in terms of ultimate reality. In many ways, that might be better, maybe better practically than the alternatives. But it's still something that can be appealed to, absolutely. It's still an absolute position, I think. It's different from, the alternative is to focus on experience, meaning, judgment, process. These are the things that really matter in religious practice, not what the reality is, beyond the sort of archetypal understanding of the meaning of the states that we enter. Then finally, Buddhism for universalists. So you get these universalist elements in Buddhism. So again, the claim that enlightenment is ultimate reality, or that the Dharma is universal. So that can turn into quite an open middle way interpretation of Buddhism, or it can alternatively be a kind of appropriation. So it can be a way of claiming that other religions are Buddhism really, so they should see it like we do, rather than actually engaging with a different view and learning from it. So all of these sort of 6 different sort of approaches that I examine, so these theistic, Buddhist and universalist views of God and Buddhism, they all offer ways forward, and they also offer potentially absolutizations. So examining them critically, I think, can lead us towards, well, obviously I'm going to say, the middle way as an alternative standpoint, which of course you can find in Buddhism particularly, well expressed, but I would also argue you can find it in many other places. So just a little bit before I wind up, and I won't be that much longer, but so I think certain qualities are needed to find and apply the middle way in these different contexts. So one thing I've kept saying is that we need a critical standpoint. So that means not just taking a tradition like Buddhism or Christianity off the shelf, unmodified, and saying, oh, I'll take that, but working with the tradition and saying, well, actually, there's some bits of this tradition or strands in that tradition which are really helpful. Let's relate to those and use them, but let's also be critical of the other strands. Now, that leads to all sorts of dilemmas in terms of social participation, which require further discussion, but there are ways of dealing with those, I think. Now, another quality I think we need is responsibility. All the religions stress that we should be responsible for our actions, but normally they'll give us a set of principles that we should follow, and to be responsible is to follow those principles. But to be even more responsible, we can take responsibility for our interpretations. Yeah, so if we say to ourselves, well, I can interpret Buddhism, for example, in these different ways, which of them is the most responsible way of interpreting it, then we're taking another level of responsibility, another level of maturity there is required in the way that we relate to these traditions. So criticality, responsibility, and finally, charity, I think. So one of the other biggest blocks in seams in the discussions between religious standpoints is interpreting what other groups say in the worst possible light just because they're another group. So yeah, essentialism and absolutism just become entrenched further if you do that. So there's an element always, I think, of taking what other people will say and saying, well, what could be helpful in that, as well as are there absolutizations in that I have to try and pick up on. You know, that reminds me of kind of Jesus' saying that we need to be wise as serpents but innocent as doves. You know, at the same time, you need to combine these two elements that we're trying to look out for absolutization, but at the same time being open to the experiences and the meanings behind people in other religious groups say. So all of this is a matter of practice, not just a philosophical position, but obviously I think a bit of philosophical reflection can help. I wouldn't have bothered writing it all down. Okay, so that's enough from me, and I'm sure you've got some reactions and questions and so on to what I've just said. So open to you. Any thoughts you'd like to bounce back, or any questions or ideas?
I was interested in what you were just saying at the end, actually, about I think you described it as the dilemma of social participation. I've been quite drawn to, well, in a way, almost practicing in two traditions, as a Buddhist and as a Christian. So I've been going to church, visiting monasteries, but also being part of a Buddhist order and having taken a Buddhist ordination. And in some ways, it's a very uncomfortable place to be, because you feel slightly, you can end up feeling sort of slightly inauthentic in both. And I suppose I was interested if you had anything more to say about that, the dilemmas of that and how that might be approached. But I suppose that also made me think about what you were talking about at the beginning, about how much of religious culture, in a sense, is to do with creating a sense of belonging and the shorthand. So, you know, in a way, that's the thing that produces the discomfort, isn't it? The kind of the fact that we're engaging, and there are assumptions about all these shorthands that are going on, in a sense. But one's own individual process can be a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I mean, I guess one distinction I particularly want to make there is between, well, solidarity, as I find a useful label for the sense of participation and relationship with others, as distinct from absolutized group thinking. And where one begins and the other ends isn't always that clear, but you can identify, for example, group biases. You know, so you can find lists of these in psychology. So the ways that groups tend to behave, which puts the group first and puts the absolute assumptions of the group first, and then the individuals conform to that. So obviously, so if you go into a church service, for example, there'll be some aspects of that which you may feel are expressive of solidarity and with ideals which at least you can responsibly interpret as being helpful. And there might be other things which, well, certainly I feel this anyway, that things that I can't participate in because they seem so obviously absolute in their interpretation. So my approach when I've been in that situation has usually been to participate in, obviously, with what I feel comfortable with and not with what I don't. So that's one sort of practical middle way, if you like. But I can't pretend that I've really resolved that for myself in every respect, because personally, I don't have any, at the moment, I don't have any close relationship with any religious groups. But obviously, I have at different points in my life, and that hasn't always been easy to navigate. But I suppose I have enough experience of trying to do that to feel, yes, it is possible, and maybe I should have another go in the future at doing that kind of difficult, tentative process of obviously you've got to find a sufficiently sympathetic group, what would generally be described as a very liberal group, perhaps. I mean, the Quakers are great, I think, for that. I do go along to the Quakers sometimes and sit in silence, and there's nothing more universal than silence. But yeah, then occasionally they speak and say something that's a bit jarring. That becomes a bit more difficult. So it's never perfect, but there are some. Yeah, obviously you can experiment also with different groups and see what works. I don't know if that answers your question to an extent.
Yeah. I was quite curious. I don't expect you to answer if you don't want to. Where would you draw a line on an absolutizing belief in your own experience when you were talking about that? That's a personal question, so if you don't want to answer it, it's fine. But I'm just curious how that worked for you. How that worked for you.
Okay, well, I mean, I discussed this a bit in my book, The Christian Middle Way. So I argued there that I think it'd be very difficult to recite the creed, for example, and it not be interpreted in an absolutist way. But some people disagreed with that. In fact, a reviewer of my book and said, "Well, why can't you interpret the creed in a non-absolute way?" And maybe you can. So it's possible. But what it means to you is going to be the key thing. Sure. But what it means to other people is not irrelevant, because that's going to have an effect on you. So in a context where everyone else is taking it absolutely, I would find it very difficult to just sit there plying my own fur, as it were. Okay, Susan, you want to?
I just wanted to say there are, in Judaism, there are communities that are middle way. I'm part of one of them in particular, two of them actually. One is called secularsynagogue.com, which is actually an unfortunate name, but there are people that have various beliefs in there, but everybody's welcome to talk about their own experience. And in fact, that's encouraged a lot, and it's very close community, and very open. And the other is a group of 6,000 people that are reading a page of Talmud a day. It takes 7.5 years to get through the whole thing. And a lot of it is completely absurd, the literature, but what's modeled is this total skepticism back and forth, even among these rabbis, that no one can decide anything. But we now, in modern times, have every sort of approach almost based on each individual and how they approach it, and people are quite free to talk about it. And the other thing is Midrash, which is common in all branches of Judaism to discuss the meaning of Bible stories, and anything goes. I mean, there's no limit to the interpretations. So you've got archetypes, and some people may approach them with absolutes, and other people don't. So it's possible to be in community in the middle way in Judaism. And also, I love your book, this book that you're talking about. I read it yesterday. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Yes, I sometimes feel from what you've said about Judaism, and most of it I've learned from you actually, but it seems that there's less at stake somehow, maybe because of the ethnic basis. I don't know if you feel this. So are you more free to experiment because you're more secure in some sense, maybe, than people who define their religion generally in terms of belief rather than roots.
That could be it, although Judaism is very diverse. I mean, the people. I think it's a culture of skepticism and argument, very strongly a culture of disagreement, and there are negative aspects to that as well. But you know, for me, combining the ideas of the Middle Way Society, you know, having been active in the Middle Way Society for quite a while, and Judaism, it just seems like a really good fit for liberal Judaism and the Middle Way. But we're not associated with power. That's the other thing. I think that when you have a church that has power, I think you might have a little bit more difficulty with the Middle Way. Judaism's never had power, except mythologically.
Except maybe in Israel today.
even there, it's more of a nationalism, not connected to. I don't connect Israel with Judaism personally. Anyway.
Can I move on to another subject?
Sure.
Your next book, which you're talking about, Archetypes, have you come across Caroline Leslie's work, Anatomy of the Spirit?
So I'm trying to work out who's talking. Is it Brenda?
Yes.
Ah, yes. No, I haven't. I don't know that book. Say more.
Caroline is coming from the point of view of being a medical healer, with a strong Catholic background, strongly influenced by nuns, has gone beyond that, has looked at the mystics of the great religions and suggested that they go beyond any individual religion. Also looked at the links between Judaism, the Christian, not precepts, what we call them, the Christian, the steps through the baptism, confirmation and all that. Can't think of the word at the moment. So I think it would be an interesting bit of your background before you start your own book. And thank you very much for the current books and your explanation as well. I feel that ultimately we all go beyond the isms, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever. Yes, there's an argument between cherry picking and going our own way, but I think my experience is that you have to go within, and that involves looking at yourself in not always very flattering lights, but it releases a lot of energy. And also I'm very aware of life being finite, and I don't want to waste my time, you know, going along with what somebody else is telling me I ought to believe, you know. And at the same time, I don't feel it's for me to be telling somebody else what they ought to believe. To a certain extent, it's like people asking the question and they don't really want to know the answer, or they want a quick fix in 5 minutes. And actually, I can understand why the Buddha perhaps needed people to ask him 3 times before he actually answered, in terms of there being some sort of consensus of the different selves towards actually really wanting to explore and to know something, and then to understand that it is and it isn't. I'll shut up now.
Right. Well, I think that's a good point about energy, that one of the effects of all these conflicts is that so much energy gets locked up in it, and diverted into it. So all these people arguing with each other, not just arguing in a helpful way that helps clarify things, but arguing fruitlessly in polarized ways. And that energy could be so much better used.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, Brendan?
You mentioned a couple of points that I was just wondering if they could get mixed up. One was charity and the other one was appropriation. And I was thinking, where does charity turn into appropriation and vice versa in your view?
Well, appropriation is where you've got a fixed view of some kind and you incorporate through interpretation the other view into yours. So you say the middle way, oh, that's really all in Thomas Aquinas, you know, so we can put it in Catholicism, it's really that. I'd see that as quite different from charity. So charity would be interpreting what someone else is saying in a way you can relate to and inquire about, that you don't immediately categorize as the other, as the opposite, as antagonistic to what you believe. So it's much more open, as I would see it, charity than appropriation is.
There's a need for respect. There's a need for respect for other views and acceptance that people are where they're at.
Yeah.
Just as we're where we're at. The other
Sure.
big difference we can say about Buddhists is that they are consciously on a spiritual path rather than other people, excluding other religions, who are just being without consciously following a spiritual path. But they're still, in my view, they're still on it. They're still how it's meant to be.
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a fatalistic sense. I mean that in an sense of acceptance.
Okay. I think Dennis wanted to come in. You're muted, Dennis. You just press your space bar. You'll unmute yourself. That's it.
There, I can speak. I've only read the first half of your book and enjoying it, and look forward to ransacking through the rest. You make a lot of the God archetype and how this is taken differently, or can be taken differently. And I was wondering, maybe you've developed this in the second half, but it seems to me the realized person archetype, whether Jesus or the Buddha, I think fits into an archetype of the fulfilled, fully realized person. That seems to me to be the basis then of a discussion that is not threatening absolutes in the way that the other discussion is. And wonder what you think of that.
Well, if it's archetypal, then it shouldn't be threatening. So I guess the way I would see an archetypal inspiration of whatever kind is that it helps to remind you of your ideals or your practice. So whether that's you see that as a realized person as you see it, so like the Buddha, for example, could be your inspiring archetype, or whether you see it as God, I guess I would argue that they're functionally the same when they're working helpfully anyway, because they are inspiring you in a similar way. So they're reminding you of that potential, basically, that openness to a new potential and to looking beyond the perspective of the current egoistic identification. Do you want to come back on that?
God, what's wrong with focusing on Jesus, which is a divine figure in Christianity, but also fully human, as is Buddha? So it's easier there when one says God, you think of the cosmic creator, father, over everything, judge, and this kind of thing.
Sure. Well, the thing is, I mean, this is one of the features of archetypes, I think, that archetypes are not the same as symbols. So archetypes fulfill a certain function for us, but could take lots of different possible symbolic forms. So what I'd see is the God archetype could be fulfilled, for example, by a mandala. It may remind you of that bigger potential. So totally impersonal symbol like that. Or just the idea of nature is another one. Can operate archetypally for people. So whether it's God or Christ or the Buddha or nature or whatever that does that for you will depend on both your culture and your personal history, but basically what makes it archetypal and what gives a similarity between a particular different instances of a particular archetype is your context. So sorry, to get a bit clearer. So there's a similarity between different instances of the same archetype for different people, which is a functional similarity, but the form that archetype will take, the specific symbol we experience and relate to, will differ between individuals and between different cultures. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sense to keep exploring.
Yeah, great. I hope my upcoming book won't come out till next year, I'm afraid, but the Archetypes in Religion and Beyond will go into that in a lot more detail. Any other thoughts? James?
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think part of the problem is kind of language and different ways of talking about what might be similar things or attempts to discover similar things, and also truth? And I was kind of listening to it and when I trained as a psychotherapist, I obviously sort of had to move between different models on occasions, and it was very hard because you were working in one particular way and then you were trying to learn a new way of working with a different set of principles or ideas or theories about how change could occur. And one of the ways that seemed to work was to have this concept of temporary certainty, where in order to try and understand something, you would sort of temporarily take it as true, if you like, up to a point, in order to learn it. And then you could abandon that certainty. And I remember going to a meeting of psychoanalysts once in Wales, and they were all getting terribly, there was so much rivalry between these people who were all psychoanalysts, and they should have really been pretty well getting on with each other, but the warfare between them was unbelievable. And one of the thoughts I had was that if you are attached, if you're securely attached to a religious practice or a religious belief, then you're quite comfortable with it being challenged or questioned or other people thinking different things, you know, because you can tolerate it, it's not a problem. But if you're not very secure in your religious practice, then other ideas or other theories or other religions coming along can be very, very destabilizing and very threatening. And I think that's when people begin to get sort of much more protective or critical of other people for disturbing the sort of certainty of the spiritual practice that they're engaged in.
Yeah.
It's a bit rambling, I'm sorry, but that's
okay. No. I mean, I think there are two levels here. That tolerance is something that most people in our society are used to, at least to some extent. Yeah. So it's our educational system emphasises it, for example, that we should be tolerant of people with different views. So to some extent, people expect that, but actually digging down into the essentialism and questioning that is another layer of challenge, I think. So people need security, I agree. They have to have a certain sense of security and confidence in order to be able to engage with this kind of questioning. But and they need to have enough to not just be tolerant, but also to reconsider, well, what do we actually mean by these things we're talking about? And that requires a certain sort of provisionality. So that's an important aspect of the middle way. I talk about it, provisionality generally applied to all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and I suppose when I was talking about language, I was talking about different languages in different countries, and you know, languages have a function of communication. I can only really communicate well in English, but I don't think that other languages are wrong or not true they work very well for people who speak that language.
Yeah.
You know, what's the problem with it?
Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask a question, Robert?
Sure.
You know, you were saying about symbols being different from archetypes, and that you could have a quite an impersonal symbol like a mandala that might link to the archetype of God. I just wonder whether you think there's important psychological differences between personal, you know, relating to archetypes in a personal way. So I guess classically one would think of Christians praying to God. Now, obviously, I understand there are gods in Buddhism, and they're probably analogues, but certainly in the sort of Western practice of Buddhism that I've been exposed to, there's, you know, even when you do things like metta bhavana, you're sort of there's kind of a bit like a kind of intercessory prayer, but it's but there's often a heavy emphasis when that practice is taught that it's not about reaching out to something other, it's about something very internal. Yeah, I don't know whether you've got anything to say about that, really.
I'm not quite getting a question from it. Can you formulate it?
Okay, so is there an important difference between those two things? Might we be missing out? When I say we, you know, I'm kind of just referring to myself as being somebody who's exposed to, you know, secular Buddhism quite a lot and practices these things. And maybe, you know, I myself do not tend to pray to God in quite the way that I did when I was a Christian. And although interestingly, I have been sort of doing that more recently in my meditation practice. And I just wonder whether you think that I might be, you know, that might be a good thing for me to do more of, that I might potentially be missing out on something, the fact that I don't relate to that archetype in a personal way.
So what you're saying is there's something to be gained from participating in a different tradition and their different ways of relating to the archetype. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, there might be important psychological difference. It feels different to pray to God as an external thing, person, than to recite phrases in the metta bhavana.
Yeah, I see. Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about that. That probably requires empirical investigation, if anything. But maybe it's a matter of compensation for the limitations we already have. You know, that some people find it more helpful to engage with something that seems, or where the emphasis is more on the other, is beyond what we already assume, as opposed to where the emphasis is on the links with what we already are. But yeah, it's obviously it's easier to get alienated if the emphasis is on the other. It may be easier to get complacent if the emphasis is on self. But yes, I've heard, for example, Sangharakshita talks about that in relation to Buddhism, that there's those two aspects of Buddhism, of the enlightenment of self and other. So obviously the symbols can work in those different ways. Nina, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'll have to take my earphones off so I can hear myself. Yeah, I wanted to come in from one of the phrases that came with me through my life from my university education was the idea that atheism is a sect of Christianity. And it was certainly something that played through my mind a lot when I was living in Malawi, where there was a kind of real universal sense of God that people had that wasn't really questioned. And yeah, there's a question in here somewhere. I just wondered whether, as from my own experience as well, there's a lot in my moving towards Buddhism, which was a kind of definition of what I wasn't, you know, kind of definition. I'm not into God. I don't believe in God. I don't believe this. I don't believe that, rather than really moving towards belief as such. And
And so there's a kind of rejection of something in there. And I suppose at this point in my life, there's a kind of turning back towards this thing I've rejected, or being far more interested in that and in the experience. And I guess also the understanding of experience as perhaps religious experience as being very interesting wherever it arises. I just wondered, do you feel that there is a kind of, you know, in what you were saying, there's so much of what we do is a kind of, or perhaps an embracing of different religions is a kind of moving against something. Is that something that prevents us from talking to each other, in that we're kicking rather than discovering, I guess? I hope that's a question.
Sort of, yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly I can relate to that through my own experience, you know, of having kicked against first Christianity and then Buddhism later on, and having to go back to them later and re-engage with them more charitably than I had before. And that's, I think it's a process a lot of people go through in order to try and arrive eventually at a more balanced perspective. So maybe that's unavoidable. You know, it's in the story of the Buddha's early life, you know, that he kicks against the palace in order to go out into the forest, then he kicks against the forest in order to find another way. So maybe we have to go through all of that. Susan.
You know, it reminded me of, I took a class once on the history of monotheism, and the instructor was really interesting. He said that the birth of monotheism is the beginning of intolerance, because before monotheism, all these different cultures had various gods that symbolized something or other. And you'd go from one town to another and you'd say, well, our god of the storm is called this. What's your god of the storm called? So I can bring something to your temple of that god. And so there was this recognition, in a way, these are almost like archetypes, although maybe they were treated more literally as real, but maybe not. Before monotheism, people respected each other's various different archetypes or gods in a way that we lost with the development of monotheism.
Maybe, but again, I suppose I come back to those two different layers. So tolerance is one layer. Okay, tolerance is really necessary first stage. And maybe they had that at their best, say, in the Roman Empire, though I'm not really convinced they had it all the time. But there's, you have to go a bit further in order to engage with different points of view and learn from them. So what I kind of feel about the Romans particularly is that they didn't really make a lot of effort to integrate the different points of view.
No, I'm talking about the Greeks. We're going further back.
Yeah, okay. But you can end up with relativism, basically. So with a relativist standpoint, then you're kind of stuck with there being different views, and you're not attempting to reconcile those views or deal with the at least the implicit conflicts between them. So relativism can provide a basis of tolerance up to a point, and maybe that's useful. But if you're really going to address the conflict, then you need to push beyond that point, maybe risk a little bit of conflict in order to engage with the other groups. Yeah, I guess I'm also a bit suspicious of sort of idealizations of paganism and polytheism. I suspect was probably more complex than that. You know, there's a bit of the grass is greener on the other side of the fence from anti-monotheists who say we should go back to polytheism. Yeah, I'm not an expert at all on that, so perhaps I should say no more. Any other thoughts? James?
Well, I was just thinking that in a way you have to have difference, don't you? Because meaning comes from difference, doesn't it? You know, my table is smooth compared to a sheet of glass, you know, but it's rough compared to some, you know. So meaning comes out of difference, doesn't it? So in order to understand things, one has to be able to appreciate and make sense of difference and explore differences.
Yeah.
And so, you know, why do you need to get to resolving the conflict? I suppose that's my question for you, because you seem to be sort of suggesting that that's the relativism is not such a good position, and one should look to move beyond that and get to some point where it all kind of comes together. Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
I'm not saying we should reach some sort of absolute unity. Just that these conflicts that we keep encountering are worth addressing. For all sorts of reasons that I mentioned earlier, you know, so like the communication difficulties they create, the energy they drain, you know, even if they don't turn into violence or anything more obvious like that. So, yeah, go on.
Sorry, I don't think, because you keep using the word conflict, and I was using the word difference, and I think, you know, differences are there. What turns difference into conflict is what I'm interested in as well, because I don't think it has to be like that.
Well, I wasn't talking about difference. Difference is fine as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, right. Yeah, no, okay, right.
But right. The difference is beliefs about difference that are the key thing. So I want to make a distinction between absolute beliefs and provisional beliefs.
Right.
So you can have beliefs about difference or about anything that can be altered and are open to alternatives, provisional ones, or you can believe that you have the whole story, which is what's likely to lead you into conflict with other stories.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So certainly not homogeneity. It's
no,
not recommending.
Right.
Any other thoughts before we wind up? Gallagher Chitter? You're muted.
Yeah, I'm back. I was very interested in the, as I think was it the 5th and the 6th, because universalism is an obvious attempt, isn't it, to kind of integrate the conflicts, isn't it, in a sense, through a kind of higher unity in a way. But I just want I'm fairly new to your ideas, but I guess and I have read quite a bit of universalist stuff and different explanations in pluralism and religion and stuff like that. But is it a case again that we don't really know that? You know, in the sense it's a kind of it's a working hypothesis, isn't it? The idea that actually all paths do lead to the same place, but actually, as far as we could tell, it could just as likely not be true as well. And so it's a kind of false synthesis in a sense. Is that what your kind of, your critique of that lies?
Yes, I mean, the idea that all paths lead to the same destination could be another version of, you know, it's all about ultimate reality, which is the way I've seen it most often expressed, for example, in various forms of mysticism, and particularly in Hinduism. So I think there's still there's a danger there of adopting that final goal as a sort of top-down absolute perspective, which you can then still use, you know, can still create conflict. You know, you could look at the probabilities. Maybe it's rather less likely to than you know, full-on absolutist versions of a particular tradition. But so maybe a staging post.
Yeah, and I guess it diminishes, in a sense, the reality of the traditions as well, doesn't it? I mean, that's its kind of weakness as an idea as well, isn't it? It diminishes the diversity and the value of the diversity, doesn't it, of paths and approaches.
Yeah, that's true as well. Yeah, so you can arrive at that sort of claim that all is one by skating over the differences, and just insisting that they are the same in some ultimate way, rather than actually engaging with the differences, which would be what I'd call the dialectical approach. So you engage with a differing opinion, see what you can learn from it, and alter your own opinion in relation to it.
I suppose I was struck in a sense as well about it, with these things. It's that the absolute claims that you're critiquing, in a sense, are the kind of opposite of humility, aren't they? In a sense, the humility is actually admitting the limitations of our knowledge, isn't it? And acknowledging the partiality of our perspective, in a sense.
Yeah.
And and that's humility is of spiritual value, isn't it? To us as individuals and collectively, in a way. So it's a more kind of humble way of progressing with things, isn't it? Yeah,
but this that people talk about intellectual humility, which is seen as a virtue of philosophy. Andy West might be able to say more about that, but it's kind of that there is an alternative kind of Uriah Heep version of humility, of course, where it becomes a kind of affectation. But see whether that's genuine humility is another matter. Okay, shall we wind up there? Perhaps we've all had enough by this stage. People beginning to slope off. So thanks very much for coming along or joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. And just to flag up a couple of things, if I think that many of you are already involved in our middle way network, but if you look on our website, you'll find out more about that. So if you want to find out more about the middle way as an approach, we do have these regular middle way network meetings every 2 weeks, where I give a short talk and then we have group discussion, regionalised group discussion. So you're very welcome to join that if you're not already involved. And the other thing is, I've got another book launch, which again you may already know about, July the 12th, on the thought of Sangharakshita. So my new critical evaluation is coming out, rather thicker book, evaluating the founder of the Triratna movement. So you're very welcome there. Anyway, thank you for coming along to this.
Thanks
Bye,
very much.
Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks,
See you
Robert.
soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rob.